In the spring of 1981, inside a secure facility operated by France's Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire in Paris, intelligence officers examined a stack of photocopied documents that would fundamentally alter the technological competition between East and West. The documents had been delivered through a carefully structured channel by a source the French had assigned the cryptonym Farewell. The man's real identity, known to only a handful of people within French intelligence, was Vladimir Ippolitovich Vetrov, a 53-year-old colonel in the Soviet Union's Committee for State Security, the KGB. Vetrov held a position within Directorate T of the KGB's First Chief Directorate, the division responsible for scientific and technical intelligence gathering. His job, in simple terms, was to help the Soviet Union steal technology from the West. And now, for reasons that were complex and would not become fully clear until much later, he was systematically betraying that entire operation to France. The documents Vetrov provided would eventually total approximately 4,000 pages, according to French intelligence assessments later shared with American officials. They detailed what Soviet intelligence called Line X, a massive, coordinated espionage program involving thousands of KGB and GRU officers operating under diplomatic and commercial cover in Western countries, tasked with acquiring technology that the Soviet Union could not develop independently. The documents included lists of officers assigned to Line X operations, their specific acquisition targets, the Western companies being penetrated, the technologies being sought, the agents recruited to provide information, and the successes the program had achieved over the previous decade. Before we trace how one man's resentment unraveled the largest technology theft operation in history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these documented Cold War cases every week, uncovering the real human cost behind intelligence operations that shaped our world. According to the documents Vetrov had provided, Line X was not a peripheral intelligence effort, but a central pillar of Soviet technological development. Between 1976 and 1981, according to KGB internal assessments that Vetrov had copied and passed to French intelligence, Line X operations had provided the Soviet Union with access to thousands of pieces of equipment, technical specifications, manufacturing processes, and software programs that would have cost billions of rubles to develop independently, if they could have been developed at all. The technologies ranged from computer hardware and software to radar systems, chemical processes, manufacturing equipment, and military applications. The espionage had allowed Soviet industries to skip entire stages of research and development, leapfrogging directly to production based on stolen Western designs. Vladimir Vetrov had not been a dissident or an ideological opponent of the Soviet system when he began providing information to French intelligence. His motivations were personal, emotional, and complicated in ways that would make sense only when his full biography became known. He had been born in 1928 in Moscow into a family that was neither privileged nor persecuted, solidly middle class by Soviet standards. His father had been an accountant, his mother a schoolteacher. Vladimir had been an intelligent student with an aptitude for languages, particularly French, which he had studied intensively during his university years at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. In the late 1950s, Vetrov joined the KGB. His facility with French and his educational background made him a natural candidate for foreign intelligence work. He was assigned to the First Chief Directorate and received training in tradecraft, recruitment techniques, and the specific requirements of scientific and technical intelligence gathering. His first foreign posting came in 1965 when he was sent to Paris as part of the Soviet trade mission, operating under commercial cover. The posting was supposed to last 3 years. Paris in the mid-1960s was transformative for Vetrov. He was in his mid-30s, married to a woman named Svetlana, whom he had met during his university years, with one young son named Vladimir Jr. The family lived in a KGB-provided apartment in a neighborhood where other Soviet officials resided. Vetrov's official duties involved facilitating trade relationships between Soviet industrial enterprises and French companies, but his actual responsibilities were intelligence collection, identifying French technologies worth acquiring, cultivating relationships with people who had access to those technologies, and recruiting agents who could provide information. Vetrov thrived during this Paris assignment. According to later reconstructions based on KGB files and interviews with people who knew him, he genuinely enjoyed French culture, literature, and the relative freedom compared to Moscow. He developed what colleagues described as a sophisticated taste for Western life. But beneath this successful exterior, Vetrov began an extramarital affair that was discovered by KGB counterintelligence officials monitoring Soviet personnel abroad. When the affair was discovered, Vetrov was recalled to Moscow in 1968, midway through what was supposed to be his second three-year posting in Paris. The recall was presented as a routine rotation, but Vetrov understood it was punishment. He was demoted and reassigned to a desk position in Moscow, working in the analysis section of Directorate T. Instead of recruiting agents and operating in the field, work he had found exciting and fulfilling, he was now processing reports from other officers, compiling assessments, and managing documentation. For a man who had experienced the stimulation of operational work in Paris, the desk job in Moscow felt like burial. Vetrov's career never fully recovered from the 1968 recall. He remained at Directorate T throughout the 1970s, gradually regaining some status and eventually being promoted to colonel, but he never received another foreign assignment. His marriage to Svetlana remained intact despite the affair, but colleagues later described it as strained. His son, Vladimir Jr., grew into a young man who appeared to have little respect for his father. Vetrov himself became, according to people who worked with him, increasingly bitter about how his career had stalled, increasingly nostalgic about his Paris years, and increasingly dependent on alcohol. By 1980, when Vetrov was 52 years old, he had been working at a desk in Moscow for 12 years. His position gave him access to enormous amounts of information about Line X operations. He saw reports from officers around the world, reviewed lists of acquisition targets, read assessments of which Western technologies the Soviet Union most urgently needed. But he was not generating that intelligence himself. He was managing it, cataloging it, analyzing it, and watching other officers receive credit for successes while he remained in Moscow, going through the motions of a career that had peaked more than a decade earlier. The precise moment when Vetrov decided to betray the Soviet Union is not documented because he left no explanation and never fully articulated his motivations even when confronted years later. What is known is that in early 1981, while on a business trip to Paris as part of a Soviet trade delegation, a trip that must have reminded him painfully of what he had lost, he initiated contact with French intelligence. The contact was made through an intermediary, a French businessman who had occasional connections to the DST and whom Vetrov had known during his earlier Paris posting in the 1960s. According to accounts that emerged years later, Vetrov indicated carefully and obliquely that he had access to information that might be of interest to French intelligence. He did not state his motivations, did not ask for money, did not make any specific demands. He simply indicated willingness. The businessman reported the contact to his DST handler, who authorized him to continue the conversation. Over the following weeks, through a series of carefully structured meetings that allowed both sides to assess the other's seriousness and credibility, an arrangement was established. Vetrov would provide documents from his work at Directorate T. The documents would be photographed or photocopied and then returned to Vetrov so that their absence would not be noticed. In exchange, Vetrov asked for nothing material, no money, no promise of exfiltration, no assistance for his family. What he appeared to want was validation, recognition that his information was valuable, acknowledgement that he was important. The first delivery of documents occurred in March 1981. Vetrov traveled to Paris again as part of a trade delegation and met with the intermediary, who brought him to a secure DST facility where the documents Vetrov carried could be photographed. The initial batch consisted of approximately 200 pages, organizational charts showing the structure of Directorate T and Line X, lists of KGB officers assigned to technology acquisition operations, and assessments of priority targets for technology theft. The DST's initial assessment of Vetrov's material was that it appeared genuine and potentially valuable, but the intelligence service proceeded cautiously. The possibility that Vetrov was a dangle, a false defector or agent provocateur sent by the KGB to feed disinformation or to identify French intelligence officers and methods had to be considered. The DST subjected the documents to intensive analysis, checking details against information from other sources, looking for patterns that might indicate fabrication or manipulation. By summer 1981, after Vetrov had made 2 more deliveries of documents during subsequent trips to Paris, the DST's assessment was that the material was genuine. The level of detail, the internal consistency, the confirmation of information that matched intelligence from other sources, all of it indicated that Vetrov was providing authentic KGB documentation, and the implications of that documentation were staggering. Line X, as described in Vetrov's documents, was far more extensive and successful than Western intelligence services had realized. The program employed approximately 400 KGB and GRU officers operating under various types of cover in Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. These officers worked through Soviet embassies, trade missions, scientific exchange programs, and commercial relationships to identify technologies worth acquiring and to recruit agents with access to those technologies. The documents included what became known as the shopping list, a detailed compilation of thousands of specific technologies that the Soviet Union was attempting to acquire. The list was organized by industry and by priority level. High-priority targets included advanced computer systems, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, telecommunications technologies, radar and sonar systems, aircraft design specifications, chemical processes, and oil and gas extraction technologies. For each target on the list, Vetrov's documents often indicated the status of acquisition efforts, which Western companies were being penetrated, which agents had been recruited, what information had already been obtained, what remained to be acquired. The documents revealed that Line X had successfully penetrated major technology companies in the United States, France, West Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Recruited agents included engineers, scientists, businessmen, and in some cases, corporate executives who provided information either for money or, in a smaller number of cases, for ideological reasons. The economic impact of Line X was quantified in KGB internal assessments that Vetrov had copied. According to these assessments, technology acquired through espionage operations saved the Soviet Union an estimated 5 billion rubles annually, equivalent to billions of dollars, by allowing Soviet industries to avoid research and development costs and to accelerate production timelines. Some Soviet weapons systems, computer systems, and industrial processes were revealed to be almost entirely derivative of stolen Western designs. As Vetrov continued to provide documents through the summer and fall of 1981, the DST faced a decision about what to do with this intelligence. The information was clearly valuable to France's own counterintelligence efforts. It identified KGB officers operating on French soil and revealed which French companies and technologies were being targeted. But the scope of Line X extended far beyond France. The majority of targets were American technologies, and the majority of Line X officers were operating in the United States. The intelligence belonged in many ways to the Americans. France and the United States had a complicated intelligence relationship in the early 1980s. France, under President François Mitterrand, who had taken office in May 1981, maintained an independent foreign policy that sometimes diverged from American positions. The French intelligence services had a reputation for protecting their sources zealously and for being selective about what they shared with other countries, even allies. But the magnitude of what Vetrov was revealing made it clear that France could not and should not keep this information to itself. In July 1981, President Mitterrand made a decision, reportedly after consultation with senior advisors and intelligence officials, to share Vetrov's intelligence with the United States. The method of sharing, however, was carefully controlled to protect the source. Mitterrand arranged to brief President Ronald Reagan personally during a summit meeting of major industrial nations in Ottawa in July 1981. According to later accounts of this meeting, Mitterrand informed Reagan that French intelligence had obtained detailed information about Soviet technology espionage efforts and that France was willing to share this information with the United States under strict conditions to protect the source's identity. Reagan, who had been president for 6 months at that point and who had made countering Soviet influence a central priority of his administration, immediately grasped the significance of what Mitterrand was offering. He authorized William Casey, the director of Central Intelligence, to coordinate with French intelligence to receive and analyze the Vetrov material. Throughout the second half of 1981 and into 1982, as Vetrov continued to provide documents during his trips to Paris, he traveled approximately every 6 to 8 weeks as part of his work with the Soviet Trade Mission. The DST passed the material to the CIA through a carefully structured liaison relationship. The CIA established a small, compartmented team to analyze the Farewell material and to develop recommendations for how to use it. The documents Vetrov provided during this period revealed not just the structure and targets of Line X, but also the specific methods being used. Dead drops, encrypted communications, meetings in third countries, the use of front companies and false identities, all the standard tradecraft of espionage was documented in meticulous KGB records that Vetrov was systematically photographing and passing to the French. He was, in effect, handing over the entire operational manual of Soviet technology espionage. By early 1982, the total volume of material Vetrov had provided was approaching 4,000 pages. The CIA's analysis team, working with input from the FBI, the National Security Agency, and various elements of the U.S. defense and intelligence communities, had identified more than 200 Line X officers operating in the United States, dozens more in Western Europe and Japan, and approximately 4,000 Soviet agents and contacts who were providing information to Line X operations. The question confronting American intelligence officials was what to do with this information. The traditional response to the discovery of espionage operations would be to arrest the spies, expel the intelligence officers, and prosecute the agents. But William Casey and other senior officials in the Reagan administration saw an opportunity for something more ambitious and more damaging to Soviet interests than simple arrests and expulsions. The idea that emerged, which would become known as Operation Farewell or the Farewell Dossier operation, was to use the knowledge of Line X to feed deliberately sabotaged technology back to the Soviet Union. If the CIA knew exactly what technologies the Soviets were trying to steal and knew which companies and which agents were being used to steal them, then it would be possible to allow the theft to continue, but to ensure that what was stolen was subtly altered to cause failures, inefficiencies, or even catastrophic malfunctions when the Soviets attempted to use it. The concept was disinformation carried to a technological level, not just false information, but false hardware and software designed to work initially, but to fail at critical moments or to produce defective results. The goal was to undermine Soviet confidence in their entire technology acquisition program, to waste Soviet resources on systems that would not work properly, and to slow Soviet technological development by leading them down false paths. The implementation of this strategy required careful coordination among multiple U.S. government agencies and cooperation from American technology companies. The CIA identified specific technologies on the Line X shopping list that were particularly suitable for sabotage. Computer chips could be designed with hidden flaws that would cause failures after a certain number of operations. Software could be written with subtle bugs or backdoors that would produce incorrect results or allow access for intelligence gathering. Manufacturing equipment could be built with components that would degrade or fail prematurely. The challenge was to make the sabotage subtle enough that it would not be immediately detected. If Soviet engineers examined stolen technology and quickly discovered that it had been deliberately compromised, the entire operation would fail, and the Soviets would know their Line X operations had been penetrated. The sabotage had to be sophisticated. The technology had to work well enough initially to pass Soviet testing and to be put into production, but then to fail in ways that could plausibly be attributed to Soviet manufacturing defects, improper implementation, or simple bad luck rather than deliberate Western sabotage. One of the most significant operations that emerged from the Farewell Intelligence involved software for controlling industrial processes. According to documents Vetrov had provided, the Soviet Union was attempting to acquire control systems, software for managing oil and gas pipelines. The Soviets were constructing a massive natural gas pipeline from Siberian gas fields to Western Europe, a project that would become known as the Trans-Siberian pipeline. The pipeline required sophisticated control systems to regulate pressure, flow, and safety mechanisms across thousands of miles. Line X had targeted a Canadian company, according to the Farewell documents, as a source for the needed software. The CIA, working with Canadian intelligence and with the cooperation of the Canadian company involved, arranged for the Soviets to successfully steal the software they were seeking. But the software had been altered. Buried in the code were subtle modifications that would cause the control systems to malfunction in specific ways. The modifications were designed to create pressure imbalances and valve malfunctions that would go undetected during initial testing, but that would eventually cause a catastrophic failure. On June 1, 1982, at approximately 11:47 p.m. local time, American military satellites monitoring the Soviet Union detected a massive explosion in a remote section of Siberia. The explosion registered with such intensity that analysts initially feared it might be a nuclear weapons test or an ICBM launch. Within hours, satellite imagery revealed the truth. A catastrophic failure along the Trans-Siberian pipeline had produced a fireball visible from space. According to Thomas Reed, who served on the National Security Council during this period and later wrote about the incident in his memoir, At the Abyss, though some historians, including Benjamin Fisher, have questioned details of this account. The explosion resulted from sabotaged control software the Soviets had stolen from a Canadian company. The malicious code had caused pumps to operate at extreme pressures and valves to fail, creating conditions that ruptured the pipeline and ignited the escaping natural gas. The explosion occurred in an uninhabited area and caused no casualties, but it represented the most dramatic success of the Farewell Dossier operation. Soviet investigators, according to Reed's account, apparently concluded the explosion resulted from construction defects or operational errors, never suspecting that software stolen through espionage had been turned into a weapon against them. The pipeline explosion was the most dramatic result of the Farewell Dossier operation, but it was only one element of a broader campaign. Throughout 1982 and into 1983, the CIA coordinated with American companies to ensure that technologies stolen by Line X were subtly defective. Computer chips with reduced lifespans, software with hidden errors, manufacturing equipment that produced parts with microscopic flaws, chemical processes that yielded lower quality outputs. The cumulative effect was to undermine Soviet confidence in technology acquired through espionage and to waste Soviet resources on systems that did not perform as expected. At the same time, the FBI used the Farewell intelligence to identify and monitor Line X officers and agents operating in the United States. Rather than immediately arresting these individuals, which would have revealed that the operation had been compromised, the FBI allowed many of them to continue operating while subjecting them to intensive surveillance and while feeding them the sabotage technologies the CIA had prepared. This approach served two purposes. It allowed the disinformation operation to continue, and it provided the FBI with detailed intelligence about Soviet espionage methods and personnel that could be used for future counterintelligence work. Vladimir Vetrov, meanwhile, continued his work in Moscow, apparently unaware that his intelligence was being used not just to identify Soviet operations, but to actively sabotage them. His trips to Paris had continued through 1981 and into early 1982, each trip providing an opportunity to deliver more documents. By the spring of 1982, Vetrov had provided French intelligence with virtually the entire documentary record of Line X operations: organizational structures, personnel assignments, target lists, acquisition successes, recruitment strategies, and operational plans. But in February 1982, Vetrov's personal life, which had been precarious for years, began to unravel in ways that would ultimately destroy both him and the operation he had enabled. According to reconstructions based on KGB investigative files that became available after the Soviet collapse, Vetrov had resumed an extramarital affair sometime in 1981, this time with a younger woman who worked as a secretary in a Moscow government office. The affair had been conducted with recklessness. On the evening of February 22, 1982, Vetrov and the woman had met in his car. According to KGB records, what happened next was chaotic and violent. An argument erupted between Vetrov and the woman. The specific cause was never clearly established, though alcohol was almost certainly a factor. The argument escalated into a physical confrontation. During this confrontation, according to Vetrov's later statement to KGB investigators, another man, apparently someone who knew the woman, approached the car and attempted to intervene. Vetrov, in a state of rage or panic or both, attacked this man with a knife that he had been carrying. The man sustained serious stab wounds. The woman, attempting to escape the car during the struggle, was also stabbed, though whether this was deliberate or accidental was disputed. Both victims survived, but both required hospitalization. The incident had occurred on a public street, and witnesses had called the police. Vetrov was arrested at the scene, drunk and incoherent, with a knife and with blood on his clothing. He was taken into police custody and, given his status as a KGB officer, the matter was immediately referred to the KGB's Internal Security Directorate. The investigation into the stabbing incident proceeded according to standard KGB protocols for cases involving their own officers. Vetrov was held in KGB detention while investigators attempted to determine exactly what had happened and whether there were any security implications beyond the obvious criminal violations. During this investigation, KGB officers searched Vetrov's apartment and his office at the Directorate T facility in Moscow. What they found in his office was a small portable camera, a device designed for photographing documents, hidden in a locked drawer of his desk. The presence of this camera, which Vetrov had no legitimate operational reason to possess given his desk assignment, immediately raised suspicions. Further investigation of Vetrov's recent activities revealed that he had been making unusually frequent trips to Paris as part of trade delegations, and that during these trips his movements had not always been fully accounted for. Vetrov was confronted with the evidence on March 3, 1982, 11 days after the stabbing incident. According to KGB interrogation records that became available after the Soviet collapse, he initially denied any espionage activities, claiming the camera was for personal photography. But when confronted with detailed reconstructions of his movements during his Paris trips, reconstructions based on surveillance that the KGB routinely conducted on its own officers traveling abroad, he began to break down. Over the course of approximately 2 weeks of interrogation, Vetrov confessed to providing documents to French intelligence. The confession was gradual and incomplete. He minimized the scope of what he had provided, claimed the documents were not particularly sensitive, insisted he had done it for personal reasons rather than for money or ideology. But even his minimized confession was enough to constitute treason under Soviet law. 3 months later, the KGB's investigation expanded to assess the damage Vetrov had caused. A team of officers from the Second Chief Directorate, responsible for counterintelligence, reviewed everything Vetrov had access to in his position at Directorate T. The assessment, completed in April 1982, concluded that Vetrov had potentially compromised the entire Line X program. Every officer, every operation, every target, every success, all of it could have been exposed. The immediate consequence within the KGB was a massive damage control effort. Line X operations were reviewed and in many cases suspended or restructured. Officers in the field were recalled or reassigned. Agents who had been recruited were contacted and warned or cut off entirely. The entire apparatus of Soviet technology espionage, which had been functioning smoothly and successfully for years, was thrown into chaos as the KGB attempted to determine what had been exposed and what operations might still be secure. But the KGB did not initially realize that the Americans had been using Vetrov's intelligence for 18 months to mount their own operation. The full extent of the damage, the sabotaged technologies, the compromised systems, the deliberate disinformation, would not become clear to Soviet authorities for months or even years, as the defective technologies Vetrov's exposure had enabled began to fail in Soviet applications. Vladimir Vetrov was tried in a closed military court in Moscow in late December 1982. The trial was secret, as was standard practice for espionage cases in the Soviet Union. The prosecution presented evidence of his contacts with French intelligence, his provision of classified documents, and his possession of photographic equipment designed for espionage purposes. Vetrov's defense, such as it was, focused on portraying his actions as the result of personal grievances and emotional instability rather than ideological betrayal. He emphasized his years of service to the KGB, his earlier successes in Paris, the ways he felt he had been mistreated after his 1968 recall. None of this mattered. The verdict was guilty of high treason. The sentence was death. Under Soviet law at the time, Treason carried a mandatory death penalty, and there was no possibility of appeal in military court espionage cases. Vetrov was executed by firing squad in early January 1983 at a KGB facility in Moscow. He was 54 years old. His wife, Svetlana, and his son, Vladimir Jr., were not permitted to attend the execution or to claim the body. They were informed of the execution after it had been carried out. According to Soviet practice in such cases, the location of burial was not disclosed to the family. The impact on Vetrov's family was immediate and devastating. Svetlana lost her apartment. KGB housing was provided based on an officer's status, and Vetrov's execution meant immediate eviction. She lost her pension rights. She was subjected to KGB surveillance and to social ostracism. Vladimir Jr., who was in his mid-20s at the time of his father's execution, lost his position at the institute where he had been working as a researcher. According to accounts from people who knew the family, both mother and son struggled with the stigma of being associated with a traitor. Vladimir Jr. battled alcoholism and depression for years, unable to escape the shadow of his father's crimes. According to later accounts, he died in the early 1990s. Svetlana lived quietly until her death in the early 2000s, having declined all requests for interviews about her former husband's case. The official Soviet position on the Vetrov case, communicated internally within the KGB and GRU, but never publicly acknowledged, was that a traitor had been discovered and eliminated. The full extent of the damage he had caused was classified at the highest levels and was not widely known even within Soviet intelligence services. The Trans-Siberian pipeline explosion was officially attributed to technical failures or operational errors, not to sabotage, and the connection to Vetrov's betrayal was known only to a small number of senior officials. In the West, the Farewell Dossier operation remained classified for years after Vetrov's execution. The CIA and French intelligence continued to use the information Vetrov had provided to monitor Soviet technology acquisition efforts and to identify residual Line X operations that continued despite the restructuring that followed Vetrov's arrest. It was not until 1996, 13 years after Vetrov's execution and 5 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that significant details about the Farewell Dossier became public. French intelligence officials, now operating in a post-Cold War environment where some of the old classifications no longer applied, revealed that France had recruited a high-level KGB source in the early 1980s who had exposed Soviet technology espionage operations. American officials, including former CIA officers and former members of the Reagan administration, provided additional details about how the Farewell intelligence had been used to conduct sabotage operations against Soviet technology and industrial programs. The revelation of the Farewell Dossier prompted a reassessment of the final decade of the Cold War and the factors that had contributed to the Soviet Union's decline and eventual collapse. Historians and intelligence analysts debated the extent to which the sabotage operations, enabled by Vetrov's intelligence, had contributed to Soviet economic and technological difficulties in the 1980s. Some analysts argued that the Farewell Dossier had been devastatingly effective, that the sabotage technologies had caused widespread failures in Soviet industrial and military systems, and that the operation had significantly accelerated the Soviet Union's economic decline. Others argued that while the operation had certainly caused problems for specific Soviet programs, the broader Soviet economic crisis of the 1980s resulted from structural factors: chronic inefficiency, excessive military spending, declining oil revenues, agricultural failures, and political rigidity that would have occurred regardless of Western sabotage efforts. What was not debatable was that Line X had been severely disrupted by Vetrov's betrayal and by the counterintelligence and sabotage operations that followed. Soviet technology acquisition efforts continued after 1982, but they never regained the systematic effectiveness they had achieved in the 1970s and early 1980s. The exposure of so many officers, agents, and methods forced the KGB and GRU to rebuild their technology espionage capabilities from the ground up, a process that took years and that never fully succeeded before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. For the CIA officers and analysts who had worked on the Farewell Dossier operation, the case became a teaching example of how intelligence could be used not just to know what an adversary was doing, but to actively shape their actions and impose costs. The operation had required patience, allowing Soviet espionage to continue rather than immediately arresting everyone involved. But that patience had enabled a far more damaging response than arrests alone could have achieved. For French intelligence, the Farewell case represented both a triumph and a reminder of the risks inherent in espionage operations. The DST had successfully recruited and handled a high-level source, had protected that source's identity during the operational phase, and had shared the intelligence with allies in ways that produced strategic benefits. But they had also been unable to protect Vetrov from the consequences of his personal recklessness. The stabbing incident that had led to his arrest had been completely beyond their control and had abruptly ended what could have been a much longer-lasting intelligence operation. The question of Vladimir Vetrov's motivations remained partially unresolved even after the full story became public. He had never provided a clear, comprehensive explanation for why he had betrayed the Soviet Union. What seemed clear was that Vetrov had not been a principled dissident opposed to Soviet communism on ideological grounds. He had not expressed democratic sympathies or religious convictions or moral objections to Soviet policies. He had not been motivated primarily by money. He had not asked for payment from French intelligence. He had not been coerced or blackmailed into cooperation. Instead, Vetrov appeared to have been motivated by a complex mixture of resentment, nostalgia, vanity, and a desire for recognition. He resented the way his career had been derailed by the 1968 recall from Paris. He was nostalgic for the excitement and status he had enjoyed during his operational years. He was vain enough to need validation that he was important and that his knowledge mattered. And he wanted recognition from someone, anyone, that he was more than just a desk officer shuffling papers in Moscow. The French intelligence officers who handled him had recognized these motivations and had carefully cultivated them. They had treated him with respect, had expressed admiration for his knowledge and expertise, had made him feel valued and important. They had not needed to offer money or promises of exfiltration because what Vetrov wanted was not material security but psychological satisfaction. And they had provided that satisfaction by treating him as an important source whose information was genuinely valuable. This psychological dynamic, the recruitment and handling of an agent based on emotional needs rather than material incentives, was not unique to the Vetrov case. Intelligence services had long understood that some of their most productive sources were people motivated not by money or ideology, but by ego, resentment, desire for revenge against institutions that had wronged them, or simple need for recognition. Vetrov fit this profile perfectly. For the Western intelligence officers who had benefited from Vetrov's information, his death and the destruction of his family raised uncomfortable questions about the morality of intelligence operations. Vetrov had been a volunteer source. He had initiated contact with French intelligence, not the other way around. But once that contact had been established, Western intelligence services had encouraged him to continue providing information, had cultivated his psychological needs, and had accepted thousands of pages of documents, knowing that discovery would mean his death. These questions had no clear answers. Intelligence work operated in a moral gray zone where the benefits of successful operations, potentially thousands or millions of lives saved, wars prevented, security enhanced, had to be weighed against the costs to individual sources and their families. Vetrov had made his own choice to provide information, knowing the risks under Soviet law. Intelligence officers had an obligation to protect their sources, but they also had an obligation to use intelligence effectively to protect their own country's interests. Those obligations sometimes conflicted. The broader historical assessment of the Farewell Dossier focused on strategic impact. The sabotage contributed to growing recognition within Soviet leadership during the mid-1980s that the USSR was falling further behind the West technologically, and that espionage alone could not close the gap. This recognition influenced Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms when he came to power in 1985. Reforms intended to revitalize the Soviet economy, but that ultimately accelerated the Soviet Union's collapse. Whether the Farewell Dossier hastened the end of the Cold War remains debatable. The Soviet Union's decline had many causes, and isolating any single operation's impact is impossible. But the operation clearly undermined Soviet confidence in their technology acquisition programs, wasted resources on defective systems, and demonstrated that the West could actively turn espionage against them. For the thousands of Line X officers and agents whose operations were compromised by Vetrov's betrayal, the consequences varied. Many KGB and GRU officers were recalled from their foreign postings and reassigned to less sensitive positions. Some were investigated to determine whether they had been compromised or whether they might themselves be potential traitors. Careers were damaged or destroyed. Some officers who had been successful intelligence operatives found themselves under suspicion and unable to continue their work. Recruited agents in the West faced different fates. Declassified FBI files indicate that numerous Line X assets were identified and prosecuted following the farewell intelligence. Some agents were quietly dropped by their Soviet handlers and never learned that their espionage activities had been exposed. Others were arrested by FBI or other Western counterintelligence services, tried, and imprisoned. Still others, whose identities were revealed but whose prosecutions were deemed not worth pursuing, simply found that their Soviet contacts stopped meeting them, and that the extra income or ideological validation they had been receiving disappeared without explanation. The legacy of the farewell operation extended into the post-Cold War period in unexpected ways. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, former KGB officers scattered to various successor states and, in some cases, to the West. Some of these officers, now operating without the protection or constraints of the Soviet system, began selling their knowledge and expertise to whoever would pay. Foreign intelligence services, organized crime groups, corporations seeking competitive intelligence. Among these officers were veterans of Line X, who had learned the techniques of technology acquisition and industrial espionage during their Soviet careers. In the 1990s and 2000s, some of them worked for Russian intelligence services that continued Line X's mission under new names and organizational structures. Others worked for Chinese intelligence, which was building its own technology acquisition capabilities based in part on the Soviet model. Still others became private consultants, essentially mercenary spies, selling their services in a global market for industrial and technological secrets. The techniques and methods exposed in the Farewell Dossier, dead drops, encrypted communications, recruitment strategies, targeting methodologies, continued to be used in this new environment, though adapted for the post-Cold War world of globalized technology and information. The fundamental logic of Line X, that it was more efficient to steal technology than to develop it independently, remained appealing to countries and organizations seeking technological advantages. For the United States and its allies, the lessons of the Farewell Dossier shaped counterintelligence policies for decades. The operation had demonstrated that it was possible not just to detect and stop espionage, but to turn it back against adversaries through sophisticated disinformation and sabotage. Subsequent counterintelligence operations, including some still classified, employed similar strategies of allowing theft to occur while ensuring that what was stolen was compromised in ways that would cause problems for the thieves. The operation also highlighted the value of human intelligence, actual spies providing actual documents, in an era when signals intelligence and technical collection were increasingly dominant. Satellites could photograph Soviet facilities and intercept Soviet communications, but they could not provide the internal KGB documents that Vetrov had supplied. The 4,000 pages he had photographed and passed to French intelligence had revealed not just what the Soviets were doing, but why they were doing it, what they considered important, what their priorities were, and what their internal assessments of their own programs revealed about their capabilities and limitations. This human intelligence dimension became particularly significant in retrospect when analysts examined how close the United States and Soviet Union had come to miscalculation and potentially catastrophic conflict during the early 1980s. The period from 1981 to 1983 saw heightened tensions, aggressive rhetoric from both sides, and several close calls where military exercises or technical malfunctions could have been misinterpreted as attacks. The detailed intelligence the Farewell Dossier provided about Soviet capabilities and intentions helped American policymakers understand that while the Soviets were investing heavily in espionage and technology acquisition, they were doing so from a position of weakness rather than strength. They were trying desperately to catch up with the West, not preparing for offensive war. This understanding influenced Reagan administration policies in ways that were subtle but significant. Rather than treating every Soviet technology acquisition effort as a prelude to military action, American officials could recognize them as signs of Soviet technological inadequacy. Rather than assuming that Soviet investment in espionage meant they were winning some technological race, American officials could see that the Soviets were so far behind that theft was their only viable strategy. This more nuanced understanding may have helped prevent overreaction to Soviet actions during a period when overreaction could have been catastrophic. Vladimir Vetrov was 53 years old when he first passed documents to French intelligence in 1981. He was 54 when he was arrested after a drunken stabbing in February 1982. He was 54 when he was executed by firing squad in early January 1983, believing he had been punished for betraying secrets, while the full extent of the sabotage his intelligence had enabled remained classified and unknown even to him. His widow lost everything: housing, pension, social standing. His son struggled for years with alcoholism and the crushing stigma of being a traitor's child before dying in the early 1990s. And the 4,000 pages Vetrov photographed and passed to the West helped collapse a Soviet technology theft program that had operated successfully for decades, contributed to Soviet economic decline in the 1980s, and demonstrated that espionage could be turned back against those who practiced it, sometimes with devastating effect, as the Siberian pipeline explosion proved. The Farewell Dossier was not a story of heroes and villains, but of ordinary people, a resentful bureaucrat seeking recognition, intelligence officers doing their jobs, families destroyed by choices they never made, caught in systems that valued strategic advantage over human cost. Vetrov's motivations were neither noble nor exceptional. His betrayal was driven by wounded pride and nostalgia, not principle. Yet the consequences rippled across continents and decades, shaping the final years of the Cold War in ways that no one involved could have fully anticipated. The operation achieved strategic success through the destruction of ordinary lives caught in extraordinary circumstances. Whether that success justified the cost, to Vetrov, to his family, to the Soviet engineers whose projects failed because of sabotage technology, to the entire edifice of trust that espionage corrodes, remains a question without comfortable answers. The Farewell Dossier exposed and exploited a massive Soviet intelligence operation. It also revealed, with uncomfortable clarity, the moral complexity of intelligence work and the human price paid for geopolitical victories that look, decades later, both essential and tragic.